And we're live.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of the first unit of the DML Commons Design Research course. My name is Rafi Santo of Indiana University, and I'm here with my unit co-organizer.
Hi, I'm Dixie Ching. I'm a doctoral candidate at NYU.
And we are here for the webinar today with a special guest, and also we are also special guests as well as presenters here. But our special guest, more special guest than us, is Dr. Christopher Hoadley, a professor at New York University and a program officer at the National Science Foundation. Do you want to say hi, Chris?
Hi, guys.
Welcome, everybody. So our lineup for today is going to focus on talking about design research stories from the field. Last week, if you were not able to make the first kickoff webinar with the guest Bill Penuel, we kind of gave an overview of what DBR and design-based research approaches are, what their purposes are, and general kind of issues around them. And this week we want to dive in to some of what actually it looks like when you put it into practice. And we have two very different projects that we'll be focusing on today, and kind of some broad history and context around DBR that Chris will provide. But in general, Chris will be talking about a project called SpeakEasy and using it as a way to talk about a little bit of the history of DBR. And Dixie and I will be talking about our project, Hive Research Lab, which also can be situated within a broader family of research approaches related to DBR. For full disclosure, Dixie and I work on the Hive Research Lab project with Christopher Hoadley, who's Dixie's advisor, and with Kylie Pepler, who's my advisor. They're the co-PIs of the Hive Research Lab project, and Dixie and I are the kind of graduate research assistants who kind of run things on the ground. So for those of you who are joining the webinar, listening, and thinking with us today, there's two consequential spaces on the internet through which you can participate. The first is in the DML Commons hashtag, where you can write questions, take notes, etc., and generally kind of tweet your hearts out as we're live streaming. And the second place where we hope you'll join us is in a public Etherpad, which I'll tweet the link out to very shortly. The Etherpad is a space we'll be able to pose questions, and we're doing some kind of like settling in over there. We see we've got a couple of people that have added themselves in. So as we're getting settled in the Etherpad, you can just put your name on the roll call, which is on line 55 right now. I see people putting their names in. And as you're getting settled in as well, we have a little bit of kind of an opening activity where if you've been involved in or are currently involved in a design-based research related project, doesn't need to be explicitly called a DBR project, but if you think that it has some relevance, maybe just write in over on line 76 in the bullets below what that project is, and maybe you can give a link to it or give a brief description. But I think it's really helpful to have a sense of what are the kinds of projects people are working on in this space, what are you interested in, what are the things that are challenging to you right now methodologically, and we can think about how we can speak to those things within the context of the webinar today. So as you get settled in, I see we've got folks from Stanford, from Boston College, from the University of, who knows what it'll be, we'll see, UCSB, Santa Barbara. So it's great to see a really diverse set of scholars from across the country joining us today. So why don't we do this? As we're kind of opening and settling in, you can type in what kind of projects you've been involved in, and maybe we can loop back to some of them. But regardless, I think the visibility of them will be really useful for other people on the webinar to see and share. I think for right now, so the way that this is going to go today after we kind of settle in is that Chris is going to be presenting a bit on the history of DBR and SpeakEasy. Then Dixie and I are going to be presenting about Hive Research Lab, and then after that we're going to kind of open it up to questions and discussion. So why don't I pass it over to you, Chris, and you can kind of dive in.
Sounds great. Thanks, Rafi.
And I'm going to do my best here to put some slides up for folks to see. So let me see if I can successfully navigate that. One moment. And just to say a sort of required disclaimer, I am, as Rafi said, I'm a faculty member at NYU, and I'm also a program officer at the National Science Foundation right now. However, views expressed are solely my own and not those of the NSF or NYU for that matter. And I'm going to quickly flip to PowerPoint. Do we have slides? Can you all see them? I'm hoping yes.
We do indeed, yes.
Okay. So Rafi and Dixie asked me to talk a little bit about doing DBR and maybe diving into one of the older examples, which was some research on a very early internet discussion tool, the SpeakEasy tool. And I couldn't resist, but also try and weave in a bit of a history lesson. The history of DBR is in many ways a history of my own career, and so I feel a strong affinity towards it. Some clarifications about what I mean when I say DBR, and given that I came up with the term, I feel I'm allowed to make some definitional claims. One is that DBR is a method, not the only method, for doing research that involves an intrinsically embedded design process. And this can be contrasted with a number of other ways you can mesh together design and research. One sort of august journal in this space is called Design Studies, and that is a journal that contains mostly empirical studies about the design process and designers. That's not what I'm talking about when I say DBR. There's also, and I think this is probably the most common confusion, is to treat DBR as identical with formative research or summative research on designs. And I think that the key difference between those two things is that in one case you have a sort of distinct research and design process, and in the other you have design as part of the research process. And finally, and this is perhaps one of the most subtle, is the goal of DBR to produce theory or to produce good designs? And if the goal is producing good designs, then I would call that research-based design and not design-based research. And one good example of that is a design firm like IDEO sends out anthropologists to help them understand design problems before they sic their engineers and product designers on it. That's an example of research in the service of design, and often in an integrated process, but not with a goal of advancing theory or forefronts of knowledge. And finally, you know, the word of the day is design-based implementation research, and I think Bill has already kind of gotten into what that means to him and how that overlaps with some of the concepts of design-based research, but they may not be identical. So I'll make those sort of points. A brief timeline. So this is ancient history, and I realize it's not necessarily very well written up in any one particular place, but I did want to kind of share with the group what this history looks like. So in the late 80s, Alan Collins, who was at the time working at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, was doing a lot of iterative design-related educational technology research, and he proposed a term in a book chapter back in 1990 called design-experiments. And in doing so, he was trying to emphasize how in certain fields, and I think, you know, again, at the time, we can think about how, for instance, the AI community was doing research on psychology, that there was a real role for research which was both engineering research and scientific research at the same time, that both tried to make something happen and tried to understand how phenomena take place. Pretty contemporary with that, and he was close colleagues with Anne Brown. She started using the phrase design experiments without the hyphen to refer to, in many cases, what we might call hypothesis finding through design work. And at the time, I believe this was right before she was president of AERA, there was an article published in Ed Researcher that talked about design experiments, and that's sort of when this movement got its start. In the mid-90s, there was a National Design Experiments Consortium at the EDC in New York City. Jan Hawkins was the head of that. In 1998, I founded the Design-Based Research Collective, although we didn't have that term at the time. We called it initially the Design Research Underground, in part because it was a group of young scholars who felt in some ways sort of stymied by the fact that the work that we had done in graduate school that involved very natural blendings of design and research wasn't always well respected out in the larger education research field. And around that time, this idea of doing design-based research kind of exploded. Again, the terminology design experiments was prevalent up to that point. In 2002, Rich Shavelson, who was then dean of the School of Education at Stanford, issued an influential National Research Council report on scientific research in education, and in part because of interactions with the DBRC, changed it from a very negative characterization of design experiments as not actually research to a more positive but tentative characterization of, again, this sort of hypothesis-finding activity. 2002 was the first use in print of the phrase design-based research methods, and that was a CSCL paper I wrote that came out in January of 2002, and it talked about SpeakEasy, and I'm going to sort of tell you the story of what's in that paper. I do recommend it if you have any interest in history and or this particular research intervention. It's a nice encapsulation. After that, there were a number of groups that were producing special issues on design experiments and design-based research in Journal of the Learning Sciences, Ed Researcher, and Ed Psychologist. And in 2012, Tom Reeves helped edit a book on conducting educational design research after several years of having his students at Georgia kind of interview and assemble viewpoints from people who had been writing about DBR up to that point. So that's kind of a quick timeline. As you've already heard, you know, there are some similarities between DBR and other research methodologies like participatory action research. There's a sense in which the intervention is the outcome. Like formative evaluation research, there's an improvement goal. Like ethnography, there's a participant and observer kind of stance, and like positivist experimentation, there's a orientation towards building falsifiable propositions. Some of the critical features of DBR, in my point of view, and to some extent others, one is that the design and research aren't sequential but are integrated, and that research is the predominant goal. It's cyclical and iterative. It leads to shareable theories, not just products. That ideas are tested in context, and we can talk a little bit more about how that works once we get to the SpeakEasy example. And also this idea of explaining not only if but how something important is happening. And I think that's one of the best heuristics to tell DBR from evaluation is there an aim to generate explanatory knowledge, or is there an aim to develop evaluative knowledge? So
Chris, have we lost you? Looks like Chris might have froze up. So we're gonna take.
Computer.
I don't know if his computer froze or if he just froze on Google Chat. I'm wondering if we have any thoughts or reflections or questions from folks that are in the audience based on the really short history that Chris has been sharing up till now. One of the things that's sort of interesting to see is sort of, you know, where was this history unfolding, and do we have Chris back?
oh gosh, when did I lose you?
About 45 seconds ago. So right when you switch to that last slide, go back one.
Back one. That one?
Go back two. One more. There you go. So at the end of this, you're about to transition into speaking.
Okay.
Yeah, you're
Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's okay.
And in fact, I may just skip these slides in the interest of time, but with a caveat that I'll share the slides afterwards, so anybody can go look at them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own work as a design-based researcher and the particular intervention that I'm going to talk about. There's actually two names for it: the Multimedia Forum Kiosk and SpeakEasy. And so this was a pair of educationally focused discussion tools developed in the very early days of, actually prior to the early days of the web and prior to the prevalence of the web. So the Multimedia Forum Kiosk was a built-in HyperCard that allowed people to have threaded discussions about videos using this brand new technology that allowed videos on computers called QuickTime. And it was a same place, different time kind of tool. We set it up as a kiosk where people could walk up and contribute comments, but there was no network-based discussion. And then that sort of morphed into this tool, SpeakEasy, which I built in 1995, and I believe was about 1 month away from having been the very first threaded discussion tool on the web. So there were threaded discussion tools that existed before in platforms like NetNews, and in fact, I believe the first threaded discussion tool was a tool called HyperNews from Germany. But SpeakEasy came right after that, so the very early days of the web. It was theoretically motivated by both work that Scardamilli and Brighter had done on knowledge building and tools for knowledge building, and then also on some other theories that I'll talk about in a minute. This is an example, or some pictures of the original HyperCard-based tool. And I'll just point out that we had two main interfaces. The first is the one you saw first, is over on the right, which was what we called the opinion area. So there was a topic posed by somebody, and then within that, anybody who's interested in participating in the topic would give their overall opinion, their general reaction to the entire topic. It was also very early days of digital cameras, and so getting people's faces into the system was quite a challenge. And so when people had accounts, we gave them the opportunity to assign themselves images from a stock base of clip art when we didn't have their photograph digitized. On the left-hand side is the discussion area, which was a threaded discussion tool in a tree representation. And you'll notice that below the comments there's little conjunctions, ... but, and, question mark, or, and these were based on the think types that the Cecil tool was using at the time, and also some basic discourse types that we pulled from 1960s speech theory. This turned into a web-based tool, and again, very early days of the web, even having a simple layout was challenging. And the very first version predated even frames, and so we had an opinion area that looked like this, where people had their individual opinions, and then we had threads, which were these issues bulleted at the bottom, which we hacked the heck out of frames to be able to display in a way that you could view the issue, view the threading, view the individual comments. And as with the Multimedia Forum Kiosk, these comments could be categorized in a way that was at one point shown by us to prompt reflection and to improve the quality of the discourse. So this research took place from around 1992 to around 1999, and we iterated in a variety of contexts. The research was usually embedded in a larger funded research project, primarily in the Knowledge Integration Environment and Computers as Learning Partners projects at UC Berkeley, led by Marcia Lin. And so we had our lab had a very strong habit at the time of collecting broad, sort of comprehensive data about what was going on, and then iterating things semester by semester basis. We had planned comparisons. We would often be able to compare different sections of the same course. We had participant observation, a lot of field work in the classroom to be able to see what was going on. We had embodied hypotheses. We had ideas about learning that we would try out by whipping up tools, whether it was curriculum or software, and then bringing it into the classroom. And then in between and during these iterations, we did a lot of capture of our design rationale and also retrospective data analysis. So not just the planned comparisons from that semester, but also looking at our old data. Just make sure I'm still with everybody. Yep. Okay. So it's worth saying that these iterations took place in a variety of contexts and with a variety of learning goals. So the MFK was piloted in a museum setting, in a higher ed setting, both as a part of a regular ongoing class and in an informal learning space, a mechanical engineering lab. It was used in an education doctoral student lounge. It was used in a middle school science classroom. SpeakEasy was used in more classrooms, in part because we were able to distribute it via the web. Again, remember the MFK had to run on a kiosk. And by the time we finished doing research on it in the late 90s, it had been tested. Between these two tools, I would say they had been tested in probably around 100 different classrooms. Some of the major shifts in the design over time, one obviously was moving to the web, which allowed access by multiple people at the same time. We called it semi-synchronous because the server was kind of slow and it wasn't always really truly synchronous. Changes in the activity structures that we embedded these tools in, changes to the anonymity features. We experimented with different kinds of seed commenting to kick topics off, different kinds of social representations, and then a lot of tinkering with the user interface because, again, the web at the time was so limited that it was hard to make a usable threaded discussion interface. And so the sort of example of a DBR trajectory that was in the original 2002 CSCL paper was really the story of how we dealt with anonymity. Initially, when we designed the MFA system, we were using theories of knowledge building and also Roy P's theory of productive discourse. One pillar of which was inclusiveness. And anonymity was initially a system feature just because we couldn't create accounts with separate images for everybody on that early HyperCard system. But later we tinkered with different models of allowing people to either use their names or not. And we had some evidence that allowing anonymity influenced equity of participation. And then we started doing comparisons. And so one of our earlier comparisons was what happens if you prohibit people from doing anonymity. Another comparison was what happens if you allow people to choose between using their name or being pseudonymous but not anonymous. So they had to pick an identity in the system. It just wasn't linked to their real-life identity. And we thought we sort of reached a point where we were increasing the gender equity in these discussions, which is especially an issue in middle school science classrooms, by allowing kids to participate anonymously. But because we were iterating, we started to notice some interesting sort of anomalies, one of which was that we had some discussions, some online discussions, where there was a lot of participation by girls and others where there wasn't. We also had some discussions where there was a lot of anonymity and others where there wasn't. And so we thought, oh, is this random variation? We started exploring it more qualitatively. And what we wound up discovering through kind of an intimate relationship with the setting and some more design tweaks was that there was a sense of safety and security that people had in knowing they could be anonymous regardless of whether or not they actually used the feature. So the anonymity feature was actually working whether or not people actually chose to be anonymous. And then we investigated some more when people were choosing to be anonymous and discovered that we could manipulate that by basically allowing people to see other people's comments and other people's anonymity choices before or after their own initial comments. And so our final design sort of allowed people to choose to be anonymous or not, but force them to choose before they saw anybody else's choices. which led to not only an increase in named comments, but also a further increase in gender equity, which was sort of what we were after with our principle of inclusiveness. Some other theoretical contributions that came out of this iterative refinement. Initially, we were very interested in multiple representations of discourse, the back and forth between the threaded and the opinion area views. We began to understand that the contextual preconditions were absolutely essential, and so as we tried to make our tool minimally useful, we had to basically confront some of the biggest design challenges around activity structures to make it work. And that led eventually to working on two theories. One was trying to better understand socially relevant representations and how different people either structure their digestion of these online discussions socially versus topically or intellectually. And then finally, some instantiations of the ways in which Bakhtin proposed that kids have to move from dialogue to monologue and back. And so Noel Ennedy and I wrote a paper about how we thought this might serve as a middle space where people could shift dialogues to monologues and monologues to dialogues. And I think at this point, I'm going to quickly check in and see if we have questions in the chat. We don't.
I'm seeing some here actually. You know, there's various channels, so I'm noticing.
I haven't got the Etherpad up in front and center.
One thing, a question that came up from Greg McVeary, or more just an area of interest, is this this issue of doing retrospective data analysis. You know, and sort of what it takes, or what kind of conditions need to be in place in order to allow for the time to do that kind of retrospective analysis and iteration, or how much of it might, you know, how structured that can be maybe, or how on the fly and integrated it can be, maybe depending on the type of intervention as well. I mean, technology-based interventions work one way versus a whole curriculum another, et cetera. Can you speak to that issue of retrospective analysis?
Sure. So I think I might even have a slide on that. Let me quickly. No, I don't have the right one. So what I would say about that is there's the core criticism of DBR is typically that there is a less planful, more emergent, let's say, argumentation grammar around what kinds of claims you're making. And it also relies in some ways, just as a ethnographer relies on their experience of culture to help develop insights about the norms and practices of culture. In DBR, the designer's hands-on actions within the space may allow them to have very informed guesses about how things are working, some of which are very tentative and hypothetical, and some of which may be very well supported by a lot of experience that was not necessarily structured in a classically positivist research design. And so the key thing with retrospective data analysis, number one, is you've got to make sure that you're able to save data across iterations and to cast a wide net. But a second set of issues, and I think this is where it's very important for DBR researchers to avoid telling themselves just so stories, is to be able to really look under the hood of your old data and say, now, if I were to be able to disconfirm this, if I'm lying to myself, how would I find out? Where would that show up? What sorts of data do I have that might allow that to be tested or proven or disproven? And so, you know, some people do a large amount of retrospective analysis across iterations. Other people do a relatively small amount of retrospective analysis and focus more on the prospective planned comparisons that happen in the, you know, in the current iteration or n+1. And I think, you know, that depends on the kinds of claims you want to make and what kinds of data you have at your disposal to be able to make those claims, especially if a design takes a left turn. It's often prior data may be less relevant. And so you may not have the option of extensive retrospective analysis. What I would say, though, is probably one of the hardest things to do as a designer is thinking, while it is an important part of your understanding of the intervention and its outcomes, is also subject to change, and it's hard to retrospectively reconstruct where you were at. And so it's important as you're wearing a designerly hat in the DBR process to document what your rationale is and sort of document the narrative of how the iterations are changing over time. Because a lot of decisions are made that are made by accident or for spurious reasons, like you know, in our case, deciding to allow anonymity was really driven by pragmatics in the beginning, and then it turned into a more principled design decision later. Okay, I will tell you what all other slides I have, but I won't go through them. I will, however, share my screen so that you get the tachistoscopic version of these slides. And as I said before, I'll try and make sure that Jameson has these to put up on the website later. But just some last parting words. Some of the things we could talk about. One is why do we need DBR? Another way of putting that is when would you bother to do this extremely hard methodology? What are some of the weaknesses that you have to anticipate in terms of getting your work out there and blind spots the method has? What are some of the advantages that the method has? And then finally, I have some practical advice here on doing DBR. Things to do at the planning stage, including what kinds of prep work you may need to do in terms of partnering with a context, what you need to think about in terms of data collection, both in the casting a wide net and in targeted data collection, how you test hypotheses, both traditional ones and embodied hypotheses, and some of the design moves that you can take as you're trying to keep the research study on course, including things like doing pulse checks, embedded cycles, shifting to additional context, inducing variables of interest from old data, replicating in place. These are some of the design moves that can be taken at the analysis phase. What are some different kinds of analysis you can do? And then finally, what are some of the issues in terms of writing? So those are some topics we can talk about afterwards if we have time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. I think one of the things that's so great hearing about this project is both just outside of the methodological side, just the fact that you guys were studying issues of anonymity and pseudonymity in the mid-late 90s is just a testament to the fact that you've been in the game in a way that predates many people are thinking that these issues of anonymity are like, oh well, Facebook forced us all into our real names, and it's like, well, people have been asking these questions for quite a long time on the internet and really principled ways in this kind of methodology. And then just to see you've got so much breadth of knowledge on sort of those tips and tricks, which definitely I think many of the folks in this course will benefit from. I think in the context of this discussion today, it's also really nice. Our hope was to see a research project and a DBR project that's very much in the traditional tight DBR realm and establish a contrast with other forms. And I think it's setting us up nicely now for Dixie and I to go into some of the work that you and Kylie have been supporting us to do in Hive Research Lab, and where to draw off of DBR and where to say actually really clearly, like, actually we're not doing DBR in this moment, we're here. And that's a bit of what we'll share as we talk about the story of Hive Research Lab, which I will kick off here through our screen share. And let's see if we can get it going. All right, I believe that we should be good. Chris, do you see our slide screen?
Yep, maybe. We can see it.
Perfect, thank you. So, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, Dixie and I, with support from Chris Hoadley and Kylie Pepler, have been working on a project called Hive Research Lab for about the past 2 years, maybe 2.5, depending on how you count. And the real idea here is to support the New York City-based Hive Learning Network, as well as to investigate it and understand what it can teach us about learning on a number of different levels. And so we're going to be sharing about that project today. The overview will start with like what actually Hive NYC is, because we know it's not intuitive or a normal kind of context to study. The second is sort of about where Hive Research Lab came from, this kind of important question of how does the research agenda get initiated and organized, and who's involved in that process is kind of critical with a lot of questions in DBR. A third is addressing how we're drawing on design-based research traditions, and I say sort of traditions and approaches, here within the context of what we're calling a research practice partnership model, and I'll say more about what research practice partnerships are. And the fourth area is just what does this actually look like in practice? Like, what are we actually doing? How did we go from this initiation and the traditions we're drawing on to actually do stuff on the ground? And finally, we have a bunch of different some time for questions from you guys about this sort of project. And hopefully through this we'll be able to then transition to talk about differences across something like SpeakEasy and an initiative like Hive Research Lab, which are really distinctive. So I'll pass it over to Dixie to talk about Hives.
So the Hive is the Hive NYC Learning Network is a consortium of over 70 youth-serving institutions, and they include community-based organizations, major museums, cultural institutions, and library systems. And it is managed in New York by employees of the Mozilla Foundation. And here's a snapshot of many of the members of the Hive. Here are their logos. It's been described as an ecosystem of opportunities for young people, so a network for learning for middle schoolers and high schoolers, as well as a citywide laboratory where educators can come together, share their stories, share their good practices, and learn from one another. So it's also a network that learns. And on the left is a map showing where the organizations are located. You can see that there is representation in all 5 boroughs with a concentration in Manhattan. So there is a collaborative donor fund that provides catalytic funding of programs and other initiatives in the Hive. And in 2012, they were interested in creating a research initiative within the Hive, but they wanted to know what that might look like in terms of supporting Hive members. So they wanted, they approached Rafi, and then Rafi approached me, asked me to join, and doing a field scan with members to ask, what sorts, if there was a research initiative, what would you like to look like? What sorts of questions would you want answered? So Rafi and I did a bunch of interviews with members. We did field observations. We held 2 brown bags where we shared interim findings and basically did some member checking there, and we also surveyed the whole network. And the results of that report led to the 2 core research areas of our formal research project, the Hive Research Lab. The first area is called Youth Trajectories and Pathways. The guiding question is, what is the nature of youth interest-driven learning trajectories within a regional educational network? So this was derived from questions members had around when a young person leaves my organization, where does she go? Where was she before she came to my program? What kind of information can we glean from that that would help me support her better in my programming? The second question, or core research area, we call networked innovation. So the guiding question is, how do regional educational networks support the development, iteration, and spread of learning innovations? So there, as I said, members come together, they talk about what they're doing in their programs. Interesting things are happening in different contexts. How is that information flowing between members and being enacted in different spaces, and what are the factors that support that?
And so we had, from this field scan, the emergence of central research areas. We also had, going in, a set of core values, and this was, really not necessarily connected to any particular research tradition, but maybe just our personal histories. Values around commitment, and being kind of community members within the context of Hive. Both Dixie and I actually came from Hive member organizations before we started grad school. Being committed to openness, having research that has utility and usability. Being committed to collaboration as a means and part of the research process, and finally issues of accessibility. How do we make ourselves available and be resources to the community? So we kind of had these these research areas, and we had these core values, but and we knew that we wanted to be more of a thermostat than a thermometer. We more wanted to help move the needle towards desired outcomes and goals that the network had, rather than just kind of taking the temperature of the network. And the big question for us at the initiation of the process, and Kylie and Chris can talk about the many, many meetings that we had at the beginning of, like, how do we actually take these values and put them to practice with our research areas while we have a really small team, a lot of different stakeholders. Dixie and I are both doing our dissertations, as part of this work, and it could very easily have had us been like, okay, we've got to let's just pare back. We'll just do basic research. We won't really try this very ambitious approach. But I think, for us, our values are really important here, and the kinds of impact that we were engaged with by the stakeholders of this network and by the members of the network were things that we wanted to make sure we met in the context of actually implementing this research project. And so we went through a long process of figuring out how do we actually do this based on what we have available and who we are. And what we came up with was kind of a layer on top of our basic research areas that we mentioned before of youth trajectories and pathways and networks innovation that we called a research practice partnership. And this is a term that comes from Cynthia Coburn and a number of other colleagues that have recently wrote a white paper where research practice partnerships are sort of long-term partnerships between researchers and practitioners, as the name implies, that are based on trust, based on mutuality, based on shared needs and interests, and based on engaging in joint work and activity. And what we did is, within the context of a research practice partnership, drew upon many different kinds of research traditions related to DBR that I'll talk about here. So what are the kind of approaches? So DBR in general was a core inspiration for the kind of work. The idea of doing interventionist research and producing research and theory through that guided the training that both Dixie and I had within the context of being in learning scientist traditions. But we also had a lot of inspiration from the emergent literature on design-based implementation research and how to focus on persistent problems of practice, how to have stakeholders at the table that are practitioners, how to really think about both the level of individual youth learning in, say, places like classrooms and after-school programs, but also the level of learning that happens in the context of networks of organizations, in the context of large systems, which is covered by our research area focused on the network of organizations. We are also really deeply guided by traditions of participatory design and co-design. The idea that any kind of intervention we might be making, anything that we're going to do that had new designs involved, was not just going to be designed by us, but was going to be in concert with members of this network and things that they actually wanted to do. Finally, or penultimately rather, we look to improvement science, which I'll speak a little bit more about, but essentially is a little bit more of a practical orientation that is similar to many of these other traditions, focused on improvement of systems at large scale. And this is something that's been successfully used in industry and healthcare, and recently has been brought into the educational world by folks like Tony Breik and Luis Gomez and their colleagues. And the final place, as Chris mentioned before, is this idea of research-based design, that we're using both the basic research that we do as well as the existing literature on relevant areas to inform any kind of designs that happen. And so we then figure out, okay, how do we take all of these being our commitments, and put them into practice on the ground? So I'll pass it over to Dixie to talk about the kind of core work that we've been doing.
So now I'll just give an overview of the three basic features of our RPP. First, starting from the left, we have a commitment to, as we do our basic research and we come across insights that we think would be of value to our members, we have a commitment to sharing that in a timely fashion. And we do that through our short briefs. And they're usually like 8 to 10 pages long. And we also have created tip sheets that we call jump starts. Next, in the middle, is something we call community embeddedness. So we consider ourselves members of the Hive, and we participate in all the participation structures that the administrators of the Hive have put together. So we're on the community calls, we attend the community meetups, we try to attend the events that get shared around on our member listserv. And we're also open to providing research advice for anyone who reaches out. So oftentimes it's a little bit of help on evaluation or looking at some sort of proposal. And through that, we're building relationships, social trust. And then thirdly, on the right, is our collaborative design experiments, which we'll go into more further in this presentation. And we just want to point out that the sorts of research we put out and also the social ties that we've created and the trust that we've created with our members have been crucial components of our design experiment story, which I'll go into next. So now we're going to go to an example of how we've used our formative knowledge to lead us to co-design activities through identifying problems of practice. And so, for instance, we have shared some formative research through our blog, and that has been sort of a network tuning mechanism for identifying an important area that we would like to encourage members to engage in. This is an example of the kind of research we have shared in the past. So in our interviews with high school students, we've asked them what sorts of social support they have found useful in their media making activities. And we identified 5 basic categories: material, knowledge building, emotional brokering, and institutional support. And we can talk to these young people, and through our interview transcripts, the coding of our interview transcripts, we come up with the people in their lives who have been important and the types of support that each person has given. And you can see this swath of support labeled with H's, which indicates support by Hive-affiliated individuals. And then if you interview the same person after Hive, and this was done during, while a person was in the Hive program, and then when the program was over and we interviewed the same person, we'd see that a lot of the support, especially in the Hive-affiliated category, went away, and we call that a post-program slump in support. So that kind of diverse formative information sharing led to us bringing up a specific issue that we wanted to focus on, and then that became the basis for a co-design. And so the way we began our co-design activity is in the past has been through charrettes. These are 1 day or 1.5 day meetings. Rafi and I both led one based on our respective core research areas. And they basically serve as a way to organize collective action around a specific problem. And basically members come together, we talk about the relevant research issues, members will start to brainstorm ideas, initiatives that they would like to explore to address these issues, and then we identify projects with a lot of heat. So basically projects that other members would like to engage in together with them.
And so moving from the kind of co-design events in the form of charrettes, we then support the development of learning innovations that might help to move the needle around these issues, and move into a process of what we kind of refer to as disciplined inquiry. And this is where techniques from improvement science come in, of using what we call plan, do, study, act cycles, which have a lot of familiarity to probably anyone who's done any iterative design. Looks quite a bit like a lot of design-based research kind of methodology, but is distinctive in various ways, and starts with kind of an analysis of causes, an assessment of a current system, a explication of improvement hypotheses, and trying out some kind of protocol, some kind of intervention that will try to move the needle on things, studying it, seeing how it's measuring outcomes, seeing how it's meeting them or not, and then kind of going through a process of iteration. And really the core questions that we use to guide this is, what are we trying to accomplish? How do we know if a change is an improvement? And what kind of changes are we going to introduce to try to meet that goal? So the one example of this that came out of our work on youth trajectories and pathways was a tool called Text Connect, which was an educator and youth communication tool that helped to ease communication and thus ease a lot of issues around maintaining contact and engaging youth on pathways. The process we went through was to kind of identify barriers, kind of articulate the particular outcomes that the Text Connect system would try to go for, map the logic of certain design features to particular outcomes, develop measures to help understand where they're meeting them, implement pilots, and then support iteration. So again, a really common set of kind of cycles. And the key here, and what was really different in working with a lot of the folks that we worked with on the ground is this very principled approach to linking certain design features to particular outcomes. So say a design feature around new program or event SMS notifications, is very specifically oriented towards an idea of an outcome of easing and improving enrollment. And this sort of allowed that sort of conjecture mapping that Sandoval talks about in his work, though at the same time not necessarily embodying high learning theory, but rather just basic hypotheses that we have about what design features will do and accomplish. And so just to kind of wrap up, in our project, doing the basic research kind of is the place that's primarily where we're doing production of learning theory, both in relation to young people as well as in relation to organizational learning. But in the process of doing so and doing formative knowledge sharing, we're identifying persistent problems of practice. We're providing shared language across stakeholders that can then be used as a basis for engaging in collaborative design experiments. And that those experiments are indexing basic research and informed by it, and they're co-designed by the researchers and practitioners. They utilize a discipline inquiry approach that isn't necessarily always present, even in the research context, is not always present when we do design, but definitely I think not always in the context of very resource-strapped out-of-school organizations is not always present, and ideally produces in-context learning innovations that allow us to meet network-level problems like issues around supporting pathways across organizations and things like that, that it's really no one organization's problem, but it is as a collective issue. So if you want to leave things there, you can kind of see more about our work on our blog that we mentioned. But I do want to kind of just loop back as we're closing in on the last 10 minutes of this webinar, and want to see if there are some reflections and questions and thoughts as we move to some discussion, and really thinking about the differences between these two sorts of projects. Maybe I can even just pass it over to Chris for a quick second as you reflect on SpeakEasy and you reflect on Hive Research Lab, just vis-a-vis this larger conversation about DBR. What comes to mind for you? What do you think about as you look at these two very different types of projects?
Well, thanks for all of that, Dixie and Rafi. I really appreciate your ability to boil down a very complex endeavor with a lot of moving parts into a small number of slides. Always a rare skill, but I think as I reflect on where we've come from on this, there's a fascinating way of characterizing the history of education research, and it's Ellen Lageman's kind of look at the 20th century, and she sort of characterizes it as, well, there was Dewey and there was the behaviorists, and Dewey lost. And so the idea that what's legitimate for producing knowledge is only sort of what I would call a rigorous science model or applied science model kind of does a disservice to the idea of engineering. So, just as chemists and chemical engineers both work with many of the same theoretical concepts and they have different aims, there is a difference between being a chemist or a chemical engineer who works in practice and being an academic researcher in chemistry versus being an academic researcher in chemical engineering. And so as we think about the learning that we try to make happen, I think what these two projects show in juxtaposition is there's a lot of different ways to blend the engineering and the science and the application of both of those to real-world settings. And so I think, as we look at, for instance, HRL has a lot of different ways in which design informs learning research, and learning research informs design, some of which might be called DBR and some of which might not, but that's okay. It's all still mutually reinforcing. And I think that's where the kind of the big stumbling block, as I see it, for social scientists in being able to embrace this is a fear of loss of legitimacy. And so, to some extent, as Logman traces it, the part of the reason for behaviorism and later cognitivism to have done so well in the education research world was that they seemed more sciencey than a lot of the other ways of producing knowledge that were prevalent at the time. I mean, I think if you asked John Dewey, he would have called himself a philosopher. And he certainly produced knowledge, but he didn't have that sort of white lab coat endorsement that people get by trying to do things at arm's length. And so as we think about having impactful research, we probably want to remind ourselves that we have many goals, some of which really are about producing certain kinds of outcomes, some of which are about producing certain kinds of understandings, and that there's different kinds of research modalities out there, some of which involve sort of science per se, and some of which involve engineering. And so I hope that especially the folks in the course can relate to that, because obviously we all have different stances, but we often bump up against many of these different kinds of stances in our work.
Yeah, and one thing I was reflecting on when you were presenting about the timeline, Chris, and I think Dixie and I have been thinking a lot in the context of our project about obviously where do we sit, what kind of methodologies are we drawing off of, what is right for this context and for what it's trying to be accomplished here. It feels like there is this sort of evolution of the design-based research conversation within fields like learning sciences and educational psychology, but also then bridging in now to fields like policy studies and implementation research, and more explicitly into stuff like design studies and how do you organize processes of collaborative design and things like that. It's sort of like, I guess maybe a question for you is, where are you seeing, as this conversation is evolving, as the DBR conversation is evolving from a place that was very oriented, in my eyes, towards establishing DBR as very distinctive and oriented towards Pasteur's quadrant of developing learning theory and doing it through the process of design and developing designs in that process as kind of like that very, very bounded and very specific, to a place where it's at least the conversation that I feel like we've been involved in has been a little bit more expansive, questioning some of the premises of who's at the table, how is the theory produced, and who is it useful for, etc. I guess, do you have any thoughts on what we should be, as the conversation is expanding to collaborative design, implementation, etc. What feels important to you as somebody who is really involved in those early stages of articulating what DBR was? What do we need to be keeping in mind now? What are it seems like these moves are useful and important to address certain kind of early gaps in some way, but there are also maybe edges that are coming along with them. And so I'm wondering if you can reflect really briefly as we're closing up in the next minute or so on this issue.
Sure. I mean, one sort of document I could point folks to, there's a jointly issued came from the National Science Foundation and the U.S. Department of Education on common guidelines for educational research. And if you look at it, it does a thing that I see a lot of people doing. It sort of lays out different kinds of research that are important, and it puts anything design and development related in a little box, and then around it allows for things like several different flavors of implementation studies that hinge on again, a sharp distinction between something where you do get to be a designer and something where you don't get to be a designer. And I think that is in some ways very helpful because it creates a space for design-linked research, but on the other hand, it's sometimes a little misleading because it doesn't necessarily acknowledge the fact that many of us have to put on a designerly hat. Even the most rigidly experimental psychologist has to design stimulus materials and interventions that are intended to stand in for their theories, and those designs may be trivial design, or they may be serious design. And I think sort of keeping the lines of communication open and their mutual respect around people who know how to do stuff in practice, but also people who know how to design interventions that go beyond the practice of one professional. That those kinds of expertise need to be part of the discussion as we try to build more relevant theory that helps us not only understand but also enhance learning wherever it may be. I mean, one sort of parting gift I would give to everybody is best thing you can do for yourself if you find this conversation fascinating is go back and read Herb Simon's Sciences of the Artificial from 1969. And you know, he's the only cognitive scientist to win the Nobel Prize in economics. He obviously helped found the fields of cognitive science and artificial intelligence, and he's in many ways very savvy about this, the nature of this problem, the epistemological challenge that is, what does it mean to do design and call it rigorous? And I think it would do us all well to remember that the issues aren't new, but maybe our ways of tackling them are.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
And thanks, Dixie, for the great co-presenting. So we're at the top of the hour, so we're going to close up. Just a couple of pieces of maybe housekeeping for those that are participating in the DML Commons Design Research course. Again, if you go to the DML Commons website and you go onto the Design Research course, you'll see the readings for this week. For this past 2-week unit, if you haven't been able to engage with them, you'll see readings both about SpeakEasy, the project that Chris spoke about today, as well as some writing that Dixie and I have done about Hive Research Lab and our kind of collaborative design process there. There are prompts in the Etherpad from last week for engaging in a blog. We still have a collaborative DBR timeline that we're engaging in. And in general, feel free to write up about the ideas and challenges you're having in relation to DBR. Put in questions on the Twitter stream, and we'll look to continue the conversation in a variety of places across the interwebs. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.